In the middle of tremendous darkness and personal tragedy, false lights are trying to guide us, and they can bring shipwreck. We must be focused on God's pathways and His light in the storms of life. Christ is the light of navigation. Hello, and welcome to the Light of Navigation and the God Stories. My name is Marguerite Lever-Woodall, and I'm an author and speaker. I write short stories about real-life, supernatural encounters with God, and I love to explore what it is, what it means to follow God's pathways. In this second episode of the God Stories, called God and the GoFundMe, I'll share with you a powerful story of God's provision on a large scale from an unexpected source. Come, join me in the adventures of the God Stories and experience the encounters with the goodness of God, even in the middle of our life storms. Why on earth would I need another charge card? Here it was, yet another charge card offer in the mailbox that day. They usually get thrown into the trash, but for some reason, my curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the envelope to look over the Capital One card offer. The credit limit jumped out at me immediately. It was $10,000. Never in my life had I ever been offered a credit limit of that magnitude. My yearly income as a florist never financially gave me that kind of a credit limit. Ever. It certainly came from left field for me that day. Because I'd been planning a trip to Rome with my son Randall that year, I reluctantly decided to keep and activate the card and use it as an emergency backup while overseas. It sure couldn't hurt. Months later, my son died from a drug overdose, and there would be no trip with him by my side. He'd been visiting his grandparents in Florida on the weekend of October 2nd, 2016, when he passed. When his death became known, so many young people shared with me how my son had touched their lives. They came during the week of preparation for his funeral service. They reached out in Facebook posts and also at the graveside ceremony. There were stories of how he had stood up for those in his school years and in life who were enduring hardship and bullying. There were many memories shared of the encouragement he so readily gave to each one, and how at times it had been life-changing for some. He cared about the down and out, those who were considered outcasts and unlovable. His love and zeal for life was an emotional sunshine for those around him. His favorite saying was, "If you ain't laughing, you ain't living." Randall had been slowly developing alcoholism and a growing drug addiction over the years. I had known about the drinking and partying and had hoped he would grow out of it as he matured, much as I had. However, I did not realize the extent of its grip on his life, and the drug addiction was much more hidden from my view, living so many miles away in another state. I had moved to Oklahoma years before. You know, in spite of this, though, he still impacted many. I wondered sometimes what would have been had he lived and been free of this addiction and followed the ministry of encouragements under God's direction that he had. He was gifted by God, despite himself. Plans were quickly made that night to fly from Oklahoma to Florida with my youngest sister the next day. At the same time, I was wondering how was I going to pay for his funeral. I knew it would be at least $10,000 for just a basic one. Was it coincidence that I happened to recently receive a credit card with the same astonishing credit limit? As I mulled over having to make payments on this card for those costs, I knew it would feel like a never-ending monthly reminder of my son's death more than anything else. It would take several years for me to pay off such a large balance. And frankly, I did not know how I would be able to endure it mentally and emotionally. But what other choice did I have? The night before our flight, my sister approached me to share a very strong word or impression she believed had come from God in the middle of our chaotic preparations. Would I be open to starting a GoFundMe to help pay for the funeral expenses? She asked. I was taken aback in that moment. I didn't think of God as a GoFundMe kind of guy. Would he actually use a GoFundMe? My opinion of this method of fundraising as a whole was that it might be unreliable, and more than anything else, for me personally, I was concerned that it might come across to others as desperate on my part and tacky. I'm a firm believer in being financially responsible, and truly the credit card looked like my only option. However, who was I to say how God would choose to help me? I gave her my permission to start the GoFundMe, not really believing that it would be productive in any way, and I moved on to packing for the flight. The next morning, 8 hours later at our first layover in Atlanta, Georgia, my sister checked the status of the GoFundMe. To our astonishment, a $4,000 donation had already been made overnight, and more were pouring in. Donations came from people in every state my son had ever worked in over the years, which was from Tennessee, Washington, Florida, and Oregon. Even former co-workers who were offshore on oil rigs in the Gulf of Florida donated as well. These were all people whose lives he had touched. That GoFundMe account hit $10,000 in less than 36 hours. And the charge card, with its large unnecessary credit limit, I had to use to pay the balance due to the funeral home because the full payment was expected before any burial. That funeral bill totaled exactly $10,000 to the penny. Then, 3 days later, the GoFundMe released the donations. It paid the charge card balance off in its entirety. I reckon the God who parted the Red Sea has no problem with GoFundMe. Thank you for taking time once again to listen to my story. If this podcast would be an encouragement to someone you know who's going through financial hardship, please pass it on. Your comments are valued, and subscribing would also be appreciated. Have you ever discovered, to your surprise, that God has orchestrated things in a loved one's life before they passed, and you didn't even know it? In the next episode of the God Stories, called God and the Funeral Song, I'll be sharing how He is the ultimate maestro in conducting life events. It's through His timeline in our lives, and we're not even aware of it.